The hyperspace rift zone was about as inviting as a Xeno's embrace, sharp, cold, and likely to leave you regretting any intimate contact. It stretched out in all its chaotic glory, a swirling mess of gravitational anomalies and space-time distortions that could turn a ship inside out faster than you could say, "bad idea." The kind of place where even the bravest pilot clutched their lucky charms and muttered prayers to gods long forgotten, or maybe just cursed under their breath, hoping to outrun their latest batch of poor decisions. Captain Vex Jorlin stood at the observation deck's grimy window, staring out at the kaleidoscope of cosmic madness with the kind of disdain usually reserved for an overcooked steak or a tax audit. "Lovely place for a peace summit," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Right up there with negotiating a ceasefire in a volcano." Behind him, Lieutenant Zara, no, not that Zara, a different Zara, and she hated the name, shifted uneasily. "At least it's got character," she offered, trying to sound optimistic. Optimism was not exactly Zara's strong suit, a fact that wasn't lost on Vex. "Character?" Vex snorted. "It's got more character than a bar brawl with 100 angry drunks. Still, better than the last place. At least there's no chance of a spontaneous eruption of plasma storms." "Yet," Zara muttered. "There's still time." Vex turned to face the assembly of individuals who would rather be anywhere else but here. A motley crew of diplomats, each representing a faction with grudges older than most stars. The kind of folks who'd stab you in the back, then complain you bled on their shoes. "All right, folks," Vex announced, clapping his hands together. "Let's get this circus underway. Try not to kill each other before lunch." A murmur of laughter, dry, humorless, the kind used to ward off the existential dread they all shared, rippled through the room. The diplomats shuffled to their seats, trying to look important and not like scared children in a haunted house. There was Thrax, a hulking brute of a Xyloc with skin like granite. Rumor had it he once survived a direct hit from a plasma cannon, though Vex suspected Thrax had started that rumor himself. Then there was Vexus, a slinky, serpentine creature from the Ilthar Collective, her eyes betraying a cunning that made a cornered snake seem friendly. And of course, the human contingent, led by Vex himself, trying to keep the peace with all the grace of a juggler at a knife-throwing contest. "I trust everyone received the agenda," Vex asked, already anticipating the myriad excuses about lost data pads and mysterious technical failures. Vexus raised a hand, her slender fingers waving like blades of grass in a cruel wind. "Received it, yes. Read it, not exactly." A few snickers echoed around the room. Vex sighed. "It's not a novel, people. It's a few pages." "If you can't handle that, maybe diplomacy isn't your thing," Thrax grunted, adjusting his seat, which creaked ominously under his bulk. "Don't see why we need paper for this. We all know why we're here. To reenact the last 100 failed peace talks," Vex replied dryly. "Because I've got a bingo card and I'm one accusation away from winning." The door hissed open, and in walked Ambassador Zorak from the Xynoxian Alliance, dressed in colorful robes that made him look like a peacock on a particularly bad day. "Sorry I'm late," he wheezed, settling into an oversized chair that barely accommodated his girth. "Fashionably late or just incompetent?" Vex asked, raising an eyebrow. Zorak chuckled, his voice like gravel in a blender. "A little from column A, a little from column B, but mostly the second one." Vex smirked. "Good to know some things never change." The lights dimmed, and a holographic display flickered to life in the center of the room. It projected a spinning image of the Rift Zone, its chaotic beauty a stark reminder of why their mission was as risky as it was necessary. "Here's the deal," Vex began, pointing to the hologram. "We're all here because, like it or not, our collective fates are tied to this lovely mess. The Rift Zone is expanding, and if we don't figure out how to stop it, we'll all be eating vacuum for breakfast." Vexus leaned back, her tail curling around the leg of her chair. "And what's in it for us, Captain? Why should we trust you and your merry band of misfits?" Vex grinned, the kind of grin that promised trouble. Because if we fail, there's no us in them anymore. Just a whole lot of oh shit. Thrax rumbled a laugh deep enough to rattle the furniture. I like this human, he's blunt. Blunt is all I've got, Vex replied, taking a sip from a battered flask. Now, any bright ideas, or should we just start bickering like the dysfunctional family reunion this is? A silence settled over the room, broken only by the hum of the ship's engines and the distant wail of the rift's chaos. It was a silence thick with unspoken animosities, the kind that could ignite faster than a pile of gunpowder at a fireworks convention. Vex leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Look, I know we've all got more grudges than a renegade AI with a hit list, but unless we figure out how to deal with this rift, we're toast. Zara, who'd been quietly watching from the side, finally spoke up. Maybe we should start by not trying to kill each other. Just a thought. Thrax snorted. Easier said than done, human. Yeah, well, so's docking a freight hauler in 0G, but we manage, Zara shot back, not missing a beat. Vexus raised a delicate brow. Your optimism is nauseating. Thanks, Zara said deadpan. I work on it every day. Vex clapped his hands once more, louder this time. All right, people, let's get down to business. And by business, I mean let's figure out how to not end up as cosmic debris. The hologram in the center of the table shifted, displaying a series of potential strategies, each more improbable than the last. The list read like a who's who of terrible ideas, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Zorak squinted at the display. What about this one? The one involving. What is that? Vex peered at the highlighted section. Oh, that, the quantum detangler. Sounds like a hair product, doesn't it? Thrax grunted. Or a fancy way of saying we're all screwed. Exactly, Vex agreed. It's risky, untested, and potentially lethal. So right up our alley, Zara said, crossing her arms. Perfect. Vex looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes with a hard, steady gaze. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone out there who didn't sign up for this cosmic nightmare. Vexus hissed softly, her tail flicking in irritation. Spare us the hero speech, Captain. We're here for results, not moral posturing. Vex opened his mouth to retort, but the ship shuddered, a low rumble vibrating through the hull like a giant's nervous cough. Lights flickered, the hologram wavering before stabilizing once more. What the hell was that? Zara asked, instinctively reaching for her sidearm. Vex didn't answer immediately. Instead, he activated the comm panel, his fingers dancing over the controls. Bridge, report. The crackling voice of the ship's XO filled the room. Captain, we've got a problem. Oh, really? Vex said, his sarcasm a dull blade. And here I thought it was just gas. It's the rift, the XO continued, ignoring the jibe. It started collapsing in on itself. We might have less time than we thought. A murmur of apprehension swept through the room, the kind that made your skin itch like a badly fitted suit. Vex turned back to the assembled diplomats. Looks like the universe just upped the ante. Time to decide whether we're part of the solution or the problem. Zorak leaned back, his eyes narrowing. And if we choose wrong, then, Vex said, a wry smile tugging at his lips, we'll at least have the satisfaction of knowing we went out with a bang. The room was silent again, each diplomat lost in their own thoughts. Vex could almost hear the gears turning, the calculations being made. Alliances weighed against survival, grudges balanced against necessity. And there it was, the cliffhanger hanging over them like the sword of Damocles. Would they find a way to avert disaster, or would they end up as just another cautionary tale, a footnote in the annals of cosmic history? Only time, and a hell of a lot of luck, would tell. The observation deck was still ripe with tension, simmering like a cheap stew about to boil over. Captain Vex Jorlin remained the ringleader of this cosmic circus, his gaze flicking between the diplomats, who looked about as comfortable as cats at a dog show. So, Vex drawled, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casualness that usually preceded a disaster. Are we going to get on with this, or should I start ordering coffins? The diplomats shared uneasy glances, like kids at a school dance waiting for someone to make the first awkward move. Vexus, the Ilthar representative, flicked her tongue, which Rena Blix, a human with about as much enthusiasm for her role as a rock has for erosion, always found unsettling. She'd been Vex's assistant for years, and if there was one thing she'd learned, it was that the longer these talks dragged on, the more likely they'd end with someone's head on a pike. "Captain," Rena said, interrupting the silence that was thick enough to chew on, "perhaps we should expedite matters before the rift decides to swallow us whole." "Good point, Rena," Vex replied, flashing a grin that could cut glass. "Anyone against moving things along, speak now or forever hold your peace. Or at least until the next assassination attempt." The diplomats tittered nervously, the kind of laughter that comes when you're pretty sure the ship's about to hit an iceberg. Vex was about to launch into his usual tirade about the futility of interstellar politics when the door to the observation deck slid open with an ominous hiss. Vex barely registered the newcomer before a sharp, metallic click echoed across the room. A second later, the world turned red. The shot rang out, startling as thunder on a sunny day. One moment Vex was there, larger than life, and the next he was slumped over the table, as lifeless as a bad joke. Rena blinked, trying to process the sight of her boss, her captain, sprawled across the polished surface, blood pooling like spilled wine. She blinked again, as if her eyes might be lying. But no, there he was, as dead as the peace talks he'd been trying to wrangle. Chaos erupted. Diplomats dove for cover, shouting and knocking over chairs in a panicked scramble. It was like every other failed summit in the universe, only messier and more final. "Son of a," Rena started, before the words were swallowed by the uproar. She'd always known Vex was a magnet for trouble, but she'd never expected the trouble to come in the form of a plasma bolt to the chest. She ducked behind a display console, her mind racing. Panic wasn't her style, but this situation required more than just a cool head and a smart mouth. It needed someone willing to take charge, and Rena was that person by default. Lucky her. "Everyone calm the hell down," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Panicking won't bring him back, and it sure as hell won't solve anything." The room gradually quieted, the diplomats emerging from their makeshift bunkers, curiosity outweighing fear. Rena stood, dusting herself off and taking a deep breath. Stepping over Vex's body felt like navigating a minefield, but she forced herself to do it. "Listen up," she continued, channeling every ounce of authority she didn't feel. "We need to figure out who the hell just shot the captain and why they thought that was a good idea." Thrax, the granite-skinned Xyloc, rumbled from his corner. Maybe he just had a face that invited bullets, or maybe someone thought blowing a hole in him would expedite negotiations, Rena shot back, eyeing the diplomats with suspicion. "Either way, we need answers, and fast." Zorak, the Xynoxian ambassador, raised a hand as if waiting to be called on in class. "And who's going to lead this investigation?" Rena met his gaze with a steely resolve she didn't entirely feel. "Got a problem with that, Zorak, because unless you've got a better idea, I'm the best shot you've got." Zorak shrugged, his robes rustling like leaves. "Fair enough, but don't expect any miracles." "Wouldn't dream of it," Rena muttered. "All right, first things first, secure the deck. Nobody leaves, nobody comes in without my say-so." Vexus tapped a claw against the table, her demeanor oddly calm. "And what about the rift? It's still collapsing, remember." "Yeah, it's hard to forget our imminent doom," Rena replied. "But unless you want your homeworld sucked into oblivion, I suggest we multitask. Some of you work on keeping us alive. The rest help me figure out who thought assassination was a smart play." Zara, who'd been shell-shocked into silence, finally found her voice. I can help with that. The rift stuff, I mean." Rena nodded. "Good. Get to the bridge, see what you can do to stabilize things. The rest of you, sit tight and try not to kill each other." As Zara scurried out, Rena turned her attention back to the room. It was a mess, much like her life had suddenly become. She wasn't sure why she'd stepped up to take command, only that it felt like the right thing to do, or maybe just the least wrong. "Here's the deal," she said, addressing the remaining diplomats. We find out who did this, we stop the rift, and maybe, just maybe, we get out of here alive. Any objections? Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the loaded kind where everyone was too busy calculating the odds to argue. Good enough for her. All right, let's get to work, Rena ordered, trying to ignore the lingering scent of ozone and blood. And remember, if anyone tries pulling a fast one, they'll answer to me. The diplomats shuffled back to their seats, muttering amongst themselves, their earlier hostility replaced by a wary truce. For the moment, at least, they had a common enemy. Whoever had pulled the trigger, if only that felt like a victory. Rena was left with the uncomfortable task of dealing with Vex's body. She knelt beside him, checking for signs of life she knew she wouldn't find. Death was final like that, and besides, she'd seen enough to know when someone was gone for good. "Well, Vex," she murmured, "you always said you'd go out with a bang. Guess you were right." She straightened, brushing off her hands. There would be time to mourn later, assuming they survived long enough to make later an option. For now, she had a job to do and no idea where to start. "Rena," Vexus said, her voice cutting through Rena's thoughts like a laser. "Where do you want us to begin?" Rena glanced around the room, taking in the faces of those she was now supposed to lead. It was a motley crew, sure, but they were all she had. "Start with the basics," she said. "Who had the motive, the opportunity? And who benefits if we're all floating in vacuum?" Thrax grunted, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Could be anyone. We're not exactly friends here." "True," Rena replied. "But if we're going to survive, we need to figure out who among us is willing to kill for this mess of a universe." Zorak sighed, adjusting his robes with a resigned air. "Guess it's time to play detective then." "Exactly," Rena said, taking one last look at Vex's lifeless form. "Let's find out who shot the captain." She stepped away, the weight of command settling over her like an ill-fitting mantle. She hadn't asked for this, but then, life rarely gave you what you asked for, at least not without a punchline. The investigation was underway, and as Rena moved among the diplomats, questioning, observing, she found herself grappling with the scope of her new responsibilities. Each answer brought new questions, every theory a dozen more doubts. But she wouldn't let that stop her. There was too much at stake, and too many lives depended on her keeping her wits about her. Hours ticked by in a blur of interrogation and deduction. Rena learned more about the inner workings of interstellar politics in one day than she had in years spent in Vex's shadow. It was ugly, messy, and about as straightforward as a bowl of spaghetti. Zorak proved surprisingly helpful, his knowledge of diplomatic backchannels invaluable. Vexus, for all her serpentine charm, offered insights into the subtle alliances and betrayals that had shaped their current predicament. Even Thrax, with his brutish demeanor, provided a perspective Rena found unexpectedly useful. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape, but the picture was far from complete. And all the while, the rift loomed in the background, a silent reminder of their ticking clock. By the time Rena called it a night, exhaustion was her only companion. She retired to her quarters, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on her shoulders. She'd made progress, sure, but the road ahead was long and fraught with danger. Lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, Rena wondered if she'd bitten off more than she could chew. But then, she'd never been one to back down from a challenge, or a fight. Vex had taught her that much, at least. As she drifted off to sleep, her mind churned with possibilities and pitfalls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and Rena would be ready. For better or worse, the captain's chair was hers now, whether she liked it or not. Rena kicked off the day with a cup of something that barely passed for coffee and a headache that felt like it was trying to bore a hole through her skull. Who knew leadership came with migraines? She shook herself awake, a mixture of determination and caffeine fueling her as she headed back to the observation deck. The diplomats were there, looking as fresh as a moldy sandwich. "Morning," she greeted, her tone as bright as a black hole. "Hope everyone got some beauty sleep, though judging by your faces, looks like a lost cause." Zorak gave a weary nod, already tired of the day. "We spent the night in here, remember?" Ah, right, Rena replied. Well, at least that justifies those charming dark circles. She skimmed through the mess of notes and datapads strewn across the table, the remnants of their late-night detective work. With Vex gone, she'd picked up the slack like a pair of worn-out trousers, and it fit surprisingly well. Or maybe it just fit badly on everyone else. We need to talk about what we found, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I was sifting through some of Vex's old logs, well, the non-confidential ones, and stumbled upon something interesting. Something that might explain why someone decided to make Swiss cheese out of him. Vexus, perched like a particularly unsettling gargoyle at the table's corner, flicked her tongue with interest. Do tell. Rena leaned in, her voice low enough to instill a sense of conspiracy. Apparently, our dear departed captain was sitting on information about a Xenoarchaeological artifact, something big enough to make waves across the galaxy. Thrax's stony face cracked into a frown. Artifact? Like what, some ancient paperweight? More like a cosmic sledgehammer, Rena corrected. According to Vex's notes, this thing's got the potential to destabilize the entire region. Exactly the sort of treasure that makes people lose their common sense and their lives. Zorak sighed, rubbing his temples. I should have known. Nothing good ever comes of ancient junk that glows ominously. Right, Rena agreed. You'd think folks would learn by now, but no, it's always oh shiny. Let's mess with it until it inevitably blows up in our faces. So, Vexus interjected with a sly tilt of her head, you think this artifact is why Vex is currently redecorating the floor? Rena shrugged, a gesture somewhere between nonchalance and helplessness. Makes sense, doesn't it? A powerful object like that, everyone wants a piece. And if Vex had any clue where it was, well, that makes him a target. Thrax grunted, the sound resonating like a landslide. Greed, the real universal language. And what's our plan? Zorak asked, clearly hoping for a straightforward answer to a question that had none. Our plan, Rena replied, is to figure out who's most desperate for this thing before they decide to finish what they started with Vex. Great, Zorak deadpanned. We're basically treasure hunting with a side of assassination. My favorite. Cheer up, Zorak, Rena said, trying to muster some enthusiasm. It's like a treasure map, only with more bloodstains. The group split into teams, each tasked with digging into different aspects of Vex's notes and interviewing the diplomats for any whispers about the artifact. Rena took Zorak and Vexus, while Thrax was given the delightful task of keeping everyone else from throttling one another. As they worked, the rift outside the observation deck continued its ominous dance, a ticking time bomb in the backdrop of their investigation. Do you trust any of them? Zorak asked as they sifted through the files. Rena chuckled darkly. Trust is a luxury we can't afford right now. I expect them to be as reliable as a wet piece of paper in a storm. I suppose, Zorak said, nodding thoughtfully. Though something tells me they might just surprise us. You know, for better or worse. Mostly worse, Rena muttered, scanning through a particularly dense document. Let's just hope we surprise them first. As the hours dragged on, so did the investigation. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces had been eaten by a black hole and the rest were busy conspiring against them. But Rena was nothing if not stubborn, and she had a talent for making sense of chaos, a skill honed from years of working with Captain Vex. Vexus, lounging like a particularly malevolent house cat, clicked her tongue with unsettling precision. You humans are quite amusing with your relentless pursuit of clarity. Rena glanced up, trying to decode the compliment buried in the venom. Comes with the territory. Adapt or die, that's our motto. Die seems the more likely option, Vexus replied, with the kind of smile that would send lesser beings scuttling away. Yeah, but where's the fun in that? Rena retorted, flipping through another log. Besides, if we weren't so damn stubborn, we'd have gone extinct ages ago. Probably would have made the universe a quieter place. Zorak looked up, a rare grin tugging at his lips. And who would want that? We're a special kind of chaos, Rena said, returning the smile. Always screwing things up but somehow making it work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of dead ends and false starts, Rena's persistence paid off. Hidden among Vex's encrypted files was a message, a set of coordinates buried beneath layers of security protocols. Coordinates that led to the artifact's last known location. Rena leaned back, exhaling sharply. "There you are, you sneaky bastard." Zorak peered over her shoulder, eyes widening as he took in the discovery. "Well, I'll be damned." "Probably," Rena said with a smirk, "but not today." She gathered the team, their tired faces lighting up with a mix of hope and trepidation as she explained the find. "These coordinates might lead us to the artifact, or at least to whoever wants it bad enough to kill for it." Thrax, arms crossed like a mountain range, nodded approvingly. "Good work. So what's next?" "We go there," Rena replied, "and see what we're dealing with, but we'll need to be careful. Whatever's waiting for us isn't likely to roll out the welcome mat." "Fair warning," Zorak chimed in. "I left my play nice mask at home." Rena laughed, a sound edged with nervous anticipation. "Good. We might just need more than one." As preparations got underway, Rena couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement beneath the stress and impending doom. It was a high-stakes game, and for the first time since Vex's untimely demise, she felt like they might have a shot at coming out on top. The ship's engines hummed to life, the vibration, a reminder that they were still, somehow, moving forward. The rift loomed ever-present, a cosmic abyss threatening to swallow them whole if they made so much as a wrong move. But they were human, and if there was one thing they'd mastered, it was making wrong moves look like the right ones. With a final check of their systems and a silent prayer to whatever cosmic powers might be listening, they set course for the coordinates. The journey was tense, each moment a balancing act between surviving the rift and staying ahead of whoever was gunning for them. But Rena's team held firm, their camaraderie a fragile yet sturdy shield against the chaos that surrounded them. As they approached the coordinates, their scanners blinked to life, revealing a derelict station, abandoned and foreboding. It drifted in the shadow of a shattered moon, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Fitting, Rena thought, that something so potentially destructive would be hidden among ruins. "Well, that's inviting," she remarked as the station loomed closer. "I can almost hear the echo of keep out signs." Zorak, peering at the station through the ship's viewport, nodded. "Or enter at your own risk." "Same difference," Rena said. "Let's see if anyone's home." They entered the airlock with a sense of caution that bordered on paranoia. Every creak of the station seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. But as they made their way deeper, what they found was even more unsettling. A series of rooms filled with ancient tech, all centered around a single pedestal. And on that pedestal rested the artifact, a sphere of dark, unyielding material that pulsed with a light that seemed to emanate from the void itself. "Well, there it is," Rena said, her voice barely a whisper. "The world's most deadly paperweight." Vexus moved closer, her gaze transfixed by the object. "Imagine what one could do with such power." "Yeah," Rena agreed, "and imagine the mess afterward." Zorak turned to her, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "So what now? We can't just leave this here for someone else to find." "Agreed," Rena replied, her mind racing. "But taking it with us isn't exactly an option either." "Not without knowing exactly what it is or what it can do." Thrax grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Then we destroy it, make sure no one gets their hands on it, ever." Rena hesitated, weighing the risks. "Might be our best bet, but we'll need to do it carefully. One wrong move and this whole place could go up in flames." As they debated their next steps, a sense of urgency pressed on Rena's shoulders. The artifact was the key to everything, but it was also a ticking time bomb. One wrong move, and they'd be joining Vex in the afterlife, or worse, unleashing something far more dangerous. But Rena was nothing if not adaptable. She'd led them this far, and she'd see it through to the end. Because if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was turning impossible situations into improbable victories. And with the fate of their world hanging in the balance, Rena was determined to do just that. Rena stood in the dimly lit control room of the derelict station, feeling like she was in a scene from a low-budget horror flick. The kind where the audience yells at the characters not to go down the dark hallway, but they do anyway because, well, plot. The ancient tech blinked and whirred around her like the ghost of a bygone era that refused to stay dead. "So, TiVo," she said, glancing at the tech-savvy engineer who was busy elbow-deep in wires, "think you can make this old clunker sing again?" TiVo Scarn, who had the kind of face that looked permanently skeptical, shrugged. "I can make it hum a tune, but it won't be pretty. Think of it as more of a screeching cat performance." "Perfect," Rena replied, leaning against the doorway. "We could use a little discordant background music for this mess." Zorak, who had been keeping an eye on the ominous artifact like it might sprout legs and start dancing, snorted. "Should have brought earplugs." "If only," TiVo muttered, pulling a tangle of wires free with a grunt. "I'm amazed this place hasn't self-destructed from sheer embarrassment." As they worked, the uneasy silence of the station was broken only by the distant hum of the ship's engines and the occasional clatter of ancient machinery refusing to cooperate. It was the kind of quiet that made Rena's skin crawl, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the right moment to swallow them whole. "Okay, I've got power to some of the systems," TiVo announced, a note of triumph in his voice. "Let's see what secrets this rusty heap's been keeping." The screens flickered to life, casting an eerie glow that made the shadows dance like they were alive. A series of security logs and surveillance feeds scrolled across the monitors, and Rena stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of the chaos. "Looks like someone was here recently," she said, pointing to a timestamp that didn't match the rest of the ancient data. "And they weren't just sightseeing." "Great," Zorak grumbled. "Guess we just missed the welcoming committee." TiVo tapped a few keys, pulling up a distorted image of a group of figures moving through the station. "Looks like our friends weren't exactly subtle. We might have a saboteur on our hands." "Or a whole damn team," Rena added, frustration creeping into her voice. "Because, doing things the easy way is too mainstream." The realization hung in the air like a bad smell. They weren't just dealing with the artifact's potential. They were knee-deep in someone else's game, and they had no idea what the rules were. Rena turned to her team, determination etched on her face. "All right, we've got two problems. A ticking bomb of an artifact and a bunch of shadowy jerks who'd rather see us all dead. Time to multitask." "Divide and conquer," Zorak suggested, his fingers flexing as if itching for a fight. "Exactly," Rena replied with a grin that was all teeth. "TiVo, keep digging. Anything you find, no matter how small, might help us figure out what we're dealing with. Zorak, you're with me. Let's see if we can find any signs of our unwelcome guests." "And if we find them," Zorak asked, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Politely ask them to leave, of course," Rena said with a wink. "With fists if necessary." They split up, TiVo diving back into the digital guts of the station while Rena and Zorak moved through the dimly lit corridors, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. "So, what's your take on all this?" Rena asked as they navigated the maze-like passages, her voice low. "Honestly," Zorak replied, his gaze scanning the shadows. "Feels like we're in one of those stories where everyone dies horribly." "Nice and uplifting," Rena said, suppressing a shiver. "But hey, maybe we'll get a twist ending. Preferably one where we survive," Zorak added, pausing to peer around a corner. "Any chance we can rewrite this script? Only if we make it out alive." Rena sighed. "And preferably without adding to the body count." As they crept through the station, the tension was palpable, a constant reminder that they were playing with fire, and someone else was holding the match. The air was thick with the scent of old machinery and the metallic tang of unease, a cocktail that set Rena's nerves on edge. Meanwhile, back in the control room, TiVo was working his magic, fingers flying across the keyboard as he pieced together a picture from the fragments of data. He'd always had a knack for making sense of chaos, a skill that came in handy in a universe that seemed hell-bent on serving up disorder with a side of disaster. "Come on, you stubborn pile of circuits," he muttered, coaxing the system to reveal more. "Show me what you've got." The screen buzzed, the image resolving into a clearer view of the intruders. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give TiVo pause. These weren't just scavengers. They were organized, methodical, and armed to the teeth. "Well, ain't that just peachy?" he mumbled, making a mental note to warn the others. It seemed like their little treasure hunt had attracted some serious competition. Elsewhere in the station, Rena and Zorak continued their sweep, the silence interrupted only by the occasional creak and groan of the ancient structure. It was the kind of place that felt alive in the worst possible way, and Rena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "You hear that?" Zorak asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "Hear what?" Rena replied, straining to catch whatever had caught his attention. "Footsteps," Zorak said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got company." Rena's hand went to her weapon, instincts kicking in. "Think they're friendly?" Zorak's grin was all teeth. "Only one way to find out." They moved forward cautiously, the sound of footsteps growing louder, echoing off the metal walls like a heartbeat. It was a tense game of cat and mouse, and Rena had no intention of ending up on the losing side. As they rounded the corner, they came face to face with their pursuers, a group of armored figures whose intentions were written all over their scowling faces. Negotiation was clearly off the table. "Well, well," Rena said, raising her weapon with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Looks like we've found our saboteurs." The lead figure, a burly alien with skin like cracked obsidian, stepped forward. "Hand over the artifact and we might let you live." "Tempting," Rena replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I think we'll pass." The air crackled with tension, a standoff that could end in violence at any moment. It was the kind of situation Rena had hoped to avoid, but life seemed determined to throw her curveballs at every turn. "Your call," the alien sneered, raising his own weapon. "But I'd think twice before making any rash decisions." "Rash is our specialty," Zorak said with a grin, his eyes locked on the enemy. With a nod, Rena signaled her intent. They'd play it their way, fast and unpredictable, because if there was one thing humans were good at, it was making the impossible possible, usually by the skin of their teeth. The ensuing fight was a blur of movement and noise, a chaotic dance of dodging, shooting, and outmaneuvering their attackers. Rena and Zorak fought with the kind of reckless abandon that only came from having nothing left to lose, their skills honed by countless encounters with danger. Meanwhile, TiVo worked furiously to override the station's systems, hoping to tip the odds in their favor. "Come on, you piece of junk," he urged, fingers flying over the controls. "Don't let me down now." The station groaned in protest, but slowly the tide began to turn. Doors slammed shut, cutting off reinforcements, and lights flickered ominously, disorienting their foes. Back in the corridor, Rena and Zorak pressed their advantage, driving their attackers back with a relentless onslaught. It was a brutal, messy affair, the kind that left bruises and broken bones in its wake. Finally, the last of their enemies fell, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Rena and Zorak exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the chaos they'd just survived. "Well, that was fun," Rena said, holstering her weapon. "Remind me to send a thank you card to whoever decided to crash our party." "Don't mention it," Zorak replied, leaning against the wall with a tired grin. "You know how much I love making new friends." They regrouped with TiVo, who was still in the control room, surrounded by the glow of flickering screens. He looked up as they entered, relief mingling with exhaustion on his face. "Guessing you ran into some trouble," TiVo said, noting their disheveled appearance. "Just a little," Rena replied, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Any luck on your end?" TiVo gestured to the screens, which now displayed a map of the surrounding space. "Looks like we've got bigger problems. Our friends weren't working alone. There's a fleet headed our way." "Perfect," Zorak muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Because things weren't complicated enough already. It was the kind of news that should have sent Rena into a spiral of despair, but all she felt was a grim sense of determination. They'd come this far, and they weren't about to let some trigger-happy visitors ruin their day. "All right," Rena said, her mind racing. "We need to act fast. If that fleet gets here, we're toast. Tivo, can you set this place to blow? Tivo raised an eyebrow. You mean turn this station into the galaxy's biggest firework display? Sure, why not? And us? Zorak asked, folding his arms. What's the plan for getting us out of here in one piece? Rena's smile was all grit and gallows humor. We make like ghosts and disappear. The plan was hastily formed, a patchwork of desperate measures and half-baked ideas, but it was all they had. They set to work, Tivo rigging the station's systems to implode on a timer while Rena and Zorak prepared the ship for a hasty exit. As they worked, the tension mounted, the knowledge of the approaching fleet hanging over them like a storm cloud. It was the kind of pressure that could make or break a team, but Rena had faith in her people. Finally, with everything in place, they piled into the ship, nerves frayed but spirits unbroken. The engines roared to life, a comforting sound that promised escape if only they could outrun their pursuers. Time to go, Rena said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Let's see if we can lose them in the rift. Zorak took the controls, his hands moving with practiced ease. Reckon they'll follow us. Only if they are feeling suicidal, Rena replied, strapping in as the ship shot forward. They tore away from the station, the stars blurring into streaks of light as they raced toward the hyperspace rift. Behind them, the derelict station loomed, a silent witness to their desperate gambit. Brace yourselves, Tivo warned, his gaze fixed on the monitors. This could get bumpy. The ship plunged into the rift, the familiar sense of vertigo washing over them. It was a wild ride, the gravitational anomalies pulling at them like a puppet master with a grudge, but they held steady. And as the station exploded behind them, a brilliant flare of light that swallowed the darkness whole, Rena couldn't help but laugh. It was a harsh, defiant sound, the kind that dared the universe to throw more chaos their way. Because if there was one thing they excelled at, it was surviving against the odds. Damn, Zorak said, shaking his head with a grin. Remind me to never doubt you again. Yeah, Rena replied, her heart pounding with adrenaline. But let's not make a habit of it. They emerged from the rift, battered but intact, the remnants of the station's destruction fading behind them. It was a narrow escape, the kind that left close calls and frayed nerves in its wake, but they'd made it. And as they set course for safer territory, Rena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. Here's to living to fight another day, she said, raising an imaginary glass. Zorak nodded, his expression as Rena stood in the observation deck, caught between the chaos of diplomacy and the sheer terror of imminent doom. The room buzzed like a hornet's nest, diplomats from every faction exchanging accusations like they were going out of style. The whole thing felt like a particularly crappy episode of a soap opera, only with fewer romantic subplots and more blood feuds. Typical, Rena muttered under her breath. Give a bunch of diplomats a chance to talk peace, and they decide it's a good time to reenact the galactic version of Jerry Springer. On the dais, Captain Vex Jorlin was doing his best to steer the conversation away from the usual bluster and chest thumping. He looked like a man trying to juggle chainsaws while standing on a slippery slope. Ladies, gentlemen, assorted extraterrestrials, he called, his voice reverberating through the room. Let's not forget why we're here. We're all tired of shooting at each other. Speak for yourself. A voice piped up from the back. It was an alien with skin like molten rock, a diplomat from the Zolian Republic. I find it quite therapeutic. Yeah, well, Vex replied, rubbing his temples as though he could massage away the impending migraine. Some of us prefer less explosive hobbies, like knitting or gardening. Beside him, Lieutenant Zara was trying to maintain order, though her optimism seemed as misplaced as a swimsuit on Hoth. Perhaps we could all agree on a temporary ceasefire, she suggested, her voice tight with forced cheer. The room erupted in laughter, a harsh, mocking sound. Rena couldn't help but chuckle. Zara's attempts at optimism were like trying to build a sandcastle in the middle of a hurricane, admirable in a suicidal kind of way. As the talks continued to deteriorate, Rena's datapad buzzed in her hand. A message from TiVo. She opened it, her stomach dropping at the words staring back at her. Asterisk trouble brewing. One of Ior's is playing both sides, asterisk of course, because things were already going so smoothly. She scanned the room, trying to catch TiVo's eye through the crowd. His face was a mask of concentration as he sat at the controls, but he gave her a quick nod, confirming her worst fears. Rena, Vex's voice cut through her thoughts. A little help here. She snapped back to reality, pushing the message to the back of her mind. There'd be time for treachery later. Right now, she had a diplomatic free-for-all to contain. Everyone, please, she said, stepping forward with the kind of confidence usually reserved for people with a death wish. Can we at least agree on one thing? If we blow ourselves to pieces, there won't be anything left to fight over. And here I thought we were just getting to the fun part. A Graxian diplomat sneered, her eyes glinting like sharpened knives. Fun, Rena shot back. If you call this fun, I've got a bridge on Mars to sell you. The laughter this time was more genuine, but only just. Rena seized the moment, pushing forward. Look, we're not asking for a miracle. Just a little cooperation, or at least not shooting each other in the face until after dessert. The diplomacy continued to unravel, the talks like a snowball rolling downhill straight towards disaster. As the arguments reached new heights, Rena couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to go from worse to catastrophic. And then, like a cosmic punchline, the door to the observation deck slammed open. Vexus strode in, an unsettling presence that seemed to suck the air from the room. Her eyes were fixed on Rena, a predatory gleam lighting up her face. Well, if it isn't Rena Blix, Vexus purred, her voice like silk over steel. Quite the show you're putting on here. Rena resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Vexus. Always a pleasure to see you crash a party. Vexus smirked, her gaze sweeping over the assembled diplomats. Such an interesting crowd, and yet I can't help but notice you're missing something. Important. Rena's heart sank. The artifact, she said, the words tasting like ash. You have it. Ah, no, Vexus replied, a mock pout on her lips. But I know who does. And they're not exactly the friendly neighborhood type. A murmur of confusion rippled through the room, the diplomats suddenly on edge. Rena felt the last shreds of control slipping from her grasp. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and it seemed like everyone was lining up to give her a shove. You've been busy, Rena said, folding her arms. But why am I not surprised? Vexus shrugged, a gesture that suggested she had all the time in the world. It's a big galaxy, lots of room to maneuver. And what do you get out of this? A front row seat to the apocalypse. Oh, Rena, Vexus chuckled, her voice dripping with amusement. I'm not in this for the spectacle. I have my own interests to protect. Rena grit her teeth, the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She needed a plan and fast. But with the peace talks collapsing and an enemy fleet on its way, options were scarce. Looks like you've got quite the dilemma, Vexus continued, her voice a venomous whisper. You're running out of friends, Rena. Not quite, Vex's voice cut in, as he stepped forward with Zara at his side. We'll get through this, or at least die trying. Always the optimist, Rena replied, grateful for their support even as her mind raced to find a way out of this mess. But her relief was short-lived. A sudden realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her datapad buzzed again, a message from TiVo flashing on the screen. Asterisk guards compromised. Get out. Now, asterisk the doors slammed shut with a clang that echoed through the chamber, sealing them in. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like wraiths. So it's a trap, Rena muttered, her voice barely audible over the growing din. Of course it is. The air was thick with tension, the kind that promised violence and betrayal in equal measure. Rena scanned the room, searching for allies but finding only suspicion and fear. Time to go, Vex said, his voice low. We can't stay here. They'll be coming for us, Zara added, her eyes wide with apprehension. Rena nodded, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. Then let's not keep them waiting. With a final glance at the gathered diplomats, Rena turned on her heel, leading her team towards the exit. But even as they moved, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into another trap. The corridors twisted around them like a labyrinth, the ancient station an unforgiving maze that offered no solace. Every step felt like it could be their last, the shadows whispering secrets and lies as they crept forward. Tivo met them at the junction, his face a mask of urgency. "We've got to move, that fleet's closer than we thought." "Of course it is," Rena replied, her tone laced with sarcasm, "because things were going so well." They moved swiftly, the weight of betrayal dogging their every step. Rena's mind raced, trying to piece together who could have turned against them. The list of suspects was depressingly long, each name another knife in the back. As they reached the docking bay, Rena paused, her gaze sweeping over her crew. "Anyone want to confess before we all die?" Silence greeted her, the tension thick enough to choke on. But there was no time for accusations, not now. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hall, the promise of violence in every step. "Guess we'll have to play detective later," Zorak said, his expression grim. They piled into their ship, the engines roaring to life as they prepared for a hasty exit. The docking bay doors groaned open, revealing the starry void beyond. "Let's get the hell out of here," Rena said, her voice steady despite the chaos that surrounded them. The ship shot forward, the station falling away behind them as they plunged into the unknown. Rena held her breath, the weight of their situation threatening to crush her, but even as they raced towards the rift, the sense of betrayal lingered. One of their own had turned against them, and the artifact was still out there, a ticking time bomb that threatened everything they fought for. Rena's resolve hardened. They'd been dealt a bad hand, but they weren't out of the game yet. The galaxy was a cruel, unforgiving place, but it was also a place where things could change in an instant. And as the rift loomed ahead, she knew that their darkest hour was far from over. But if there was one thing Rena was good at, it was finding a way through the darkness. "Hold on tight," she called, the ship entering the rift with a lurch. "We've got a long way to go." The stars blurred around them, a dizzying whirl of light and motion that promised both danger and escape. Rena's grip tightened on the controls, her determination unwavering. Because in the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding the truth, no matter how ugly, and fighting back against the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. The ship jolted like a drunkard on a bender as it plunged through the hyperspace rift, making everyone on board wish they'd skipped lunch. Rena clung to her seat, her knuckles white against the worn leather. "Next time," she grunted, "remind me to install seatbelts." Tivo, fiddling with the controls for the umpteenth time, smirked over his shoulder. "Wouldn't count on next time if we keep this up." "I've seen more organized chaos in a toddler's scribbles." Vex grunted in agreement, though his eyes never left the view ahead, a swirling mess of distorted space that looked about as inviting as an open-air funeral on a rainy day. "Tivo, any chance you can make this ride smoother?" "Sure, Captain, and while I'm at it, I'll make us all immortal with a side of invulnerability," Tivo shot back, sarcasm dripping like motor oil from a leaky engine. Amidst the turbulence, Rena's datapad buzzed persistently. A distraction she didn't need, but considering their luck so far, probably a message she couldn't afford to ignore. She glanced at it, a frown etching itself onto her face deeper than the lines of a weathered map. "Something wrong?" Vex asked, still trying to avoid a migraine that seemed as inevitable as taxes. "More like something right for once," Rena replied, her voice tinged with reluctant hope. "Message from you, Captain. Encoded, of course, like a love letter written in hieroglyphics." Vex raised an eyebrow. "Since when do I send love letters?" "You don't," Rena said, "which is why I think it's important. It's about the artifact." The mention of the artifact was enough to grab everyone's attention. Like the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, it cut through the fog of exhaustion and dread, providing a much-needed jolt. "What's it say?" Tivo asked, his curiosity piqued. "Give me a sec," Rena muttered, her fingers dancing over the datapad with the grace of a pianist in fast forward. She decoded the message, her eyes scanning the text with increasing interest. It's coordinates and a warning. A warning, Zara quipped, unable to keep the sarcasm at bay even in the face of potential revelation. How refreshing. We get those like they're buy one get one free. Yeah, and this one's the special edition, Rena replied, her gaze steady. It says the location is connected to the artifact, something about an ancient vault, but it's heavily guarded and, get this, possibly haunted. Haunted. Vex's voice was a mix of skepticism and dark amusement. By what? The ghosts of diplomacy past. Hey, I didn't write the message, Rena retorted. But if we've learned anything, it's that ancient tech and spooky legends go together like space and vacuum. So what's the plan, oh fearless leader? Thrax drawled from the back, his usual skepticism tinged with a hint of intrigue. Rena leaned back, her mind racing with possibilities. We need to get to those coordinates. If the artifact's there, it could be our ace in the hole, or at least a card that's not a joker. Zorak crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. And how exactly do we get past heavily guarded? I left my tank at home. We improvise, Rena said, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Just like we always do. Only this time we do it better. Define better, Zara said, a glimmer of hope tempered by the weight of experience. Because our track record is a little spotty. Spotty? Tivo snorted. It's more like a Dalmatian. Rena couldn't help but chuckle, the levity a brief respite from their grim circumstances. Fair point. But this time we've got something we didn't have before, a lead. And the element of surprise might just tip things in our favor. And if it doesn't? Vex asked, his gaze steady. Rena shrugged, though her eyes spoke of determination that could etch itself into stone. Then we go down swinging, but I'd rather not make that a habit. With a renewed sense of purpose, however tentative, they set their course for the coordinates. The galaxy outside was indifferent to their plight, a vast emptiness punctuated by distant stars that twinkled like the eyes of uncaring gods. As they hurtled through hyperspace, Rena took a moment to check her datapad again, scrolling through the endless stream of data and intel that had become her lifeline. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the turning point they'd been waiting for, the moment where everything could change. What's our ETA, Tivo? She asked, needing to focus on something other than the impending sense of doom. Couple of hours, give or take, Tivo replied, still tinkering with the controls. Plenty of time to second-guess ourselves. Or to plan, Rena countered, her voice firm. We're not going in blind. We need to scout the area, assess the defenses, and figure out what we're up against. And if it's worse than we thought, Zara asked, her optimism cautiously peeking out like a hedgehog from its burrow. We adapt, Rena said, her resolve hardening like cooled lava. We've faced worse odds before. It's not about having all the answers, it's about finding them when it matters. Or making up a few along the way, Vex muttered, his expression a mixture of doubt and grudging admiration. Exactly, Rena said, a spark in her eyes. The galaxy's a mess and we're in the thick of it. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way to make things right, or at least not worse. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise wrapped into one. They were up against forces greater than themselves, but they weren't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the ship hurtled towards its destination, Rena let herself hope, not naively but with the kind of fierce determination that could light up the darkest corners of the universe. She had her crew, a lead and a plan that might just defy the odds. Because in the end, it wasn't just about finding the artifact or uncovering the truth. It was about proving that even in the vast, uncaring expanse of space, they mattered. And that was a victory worth fighting for. As the stars blurred into a kaleidoscope of light, Rena felt a flicker of something she hadn't in a long time, hope. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but it was a path all the same, and she would walk it no matter where it led. All right, everyone, she said, her voice steady and clear. Let's get ready. We've got a job to do, and I don't plan on failing. With that, they plunged into the unknown, a small, defiant beacon against the encroaching dark. because while the universe might be indifferent, they were anything but. And that, Rena decided, was a damn good place to start. The ship stumbled out of hyperspace like a sleep-deprived intern on a Monday morning, disheveled, slightly bewildered but stubbornly upright. Rena exhaled, a mix of relief and the vague suspicion that the universe was about to pull one over on her yet again. Touchdown without implosion, Tivo quipped, still fiddling with the controls as if they might spring to life and bite him. Guess we used up our miracle quota for the day. Don't get too comfy, Rena said, her eyes scanning the readings. We've got coordinates and a ghost story to solve. Right, said Vex, leaning back in his chair. Because nothing says relaxing afternoon like potential death traps and haunted relics. The rest of the crew filed into the cramped room like sardines in a can, if sardines carried weapons, and looked like they were ready to punch a ghost in the face. Zorak, stoic as ever, stood with his arms crossed, while Thrax exuded skepticism like a cologne gone sour. Spooky vault with an artifact inside, Zorak noted, his voice dry as a desert. Sounds straightforward, like a game of Russian roulette is straightforward, Thrax added. Except we don't even know how many bullets are in the chamber. Rena held up her datapad, the decoded message a beacon of hope, or maybe a siren's call. We've got the coordinates. Now we just need a plan to get in, grab the artifact, and get out with all our limbs attached. Simple, Tivo smirked, a spark of mischief in his eyes. We hit them with something they won't see coming. Like what? Zara asked, her optimism peeking through like sunlight through storm clouds. Good old human ingenuity, Rena replied, a grin spreading across her face. And maybe a little reckless abandon, Thrax raised an eyebrow. Reckless abandon. My favorite, Rena turned to the crew, her mind already racing. Okay, listen up. First, we'll need a distraction. Something big, flashy, and utterly insane. Vex grinned, a rare sight that made the room feel a little warmer. How about we light up the sky? An old-fashioned fireworks show. Perfect, Rena said, nodding. While everyone's gawking at the pyrotechnics, we slip through and get what we came for, and if they don't fall for it, Zara asked, ever the voice of caution. Then we adapt, Rena shot back, or improvise, or panic. Really just whatever feels right in the moment. Tivo cracked his knuckles, a look of eager anticipation on his face. Guess it's time to show them what we're made of, which is mostly caffeine and stubbornness. An hour later, they found themselves crouched behind a rocky outcrop, the vault's entrance looming ominously in the distance. It was guarded by a mix of bored-looking sentries and automated turrets that hummed with a low, threatening energy. Nice place, Thrax whispered dryly. Looks like the kind of joint that charges for water and gives you a side of imminent death. Rena checked her datapad, the coordinates leading them right to the front door. Right, let's get this show on the road. Vex stepped forward, a mischievous glint in his eyes. He activated a device cobbled together from spare parts and sheer optimism, tossing it skyward. It rose into the air, sputtering and spitting like a temperamental fountain before igniting with a flash and a series of loud bangs. Fireworks, Tivo said with a grin. Just like we promised. The sentries snapped to attention, their focus drawn to the spectacle above. For a moment, it was all light and noise, a beautiful distraction that Rena hoped would hold their attention long enough. Now, Rena hissed, and the crew darted forward like shadows in the night. They reached the entrance without incident, the guards too busy gawking at the sky to notice their bold approach. Rena punched in the access code, a string of numbers gifted by her mysterious message. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a dark corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. Okay, Rena breathed, stepping inside. We're in. Now comes the fun part, Zorak murmured, his gaze sharp and focused. They navigated the dimly lit hallway, the air thick with dust and the scent of disuse. The vault was a relic from a bygone era, its walls lined with ancient technology that hummed with a life of its own. Reminds me of my first apartment, Thrax joked, his voice echoing off the walls. Except this place is probably more structurally sound. Rena led the way, her heart pounding in her chest. They passed through a series of chambers, each one filled with odd contraptions and artifacts that whispered of secrets long buried. Getting warmer, Rena muttered, her eyes fixed on the datapad. The artifact should be just ahead. They entered the final chamber, a vast room dominated by a pedestal at its center. And there, bathed in an eerie glow, was the artifact, a thing of beauty and menace, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe. "That's it," Rena whispered, awe and trepidation warring within her. "Looks like a fancy paperweight," Tivo said, though his voice held a note of respect. Rena approached the pedestal, her every instinct screaming caution. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the artifact's cool surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a pulse of energy shot through her, a jolt that left her reeling. "Rena." Vex's voice was filled with concern, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was shaky. "It's just powerful." "More than I expected and dangerous?" Zara asked, ever pragmatic. "Maybe," Rena replied, her mind racing. "But it's also the key to stopping a war." "How?" Thrax demanded, his skepticism flaring. Rena turned to face them, the truth dawning on her like a long-lost memory. The artifact isn't just a weapon. It's a tool, a way to bridge the gap between us and them. "Diplomacy?" Zorak asked, disbelief coloring his tone. "Interaction," Rena corrected. "Understanding. This thing can connect us, help us see the universe in a way we never could before." The crew exchanged glances, a mix of hope and doubt in their eyes. It was a gamble, an insane leap of faith, but it was also their best shot. "All right," Vex said, determination hardening his features. "Let's get it back to the ship and figure out how to use it." They moved quickly, retracing their steps through the maze of corridors. The sentries were still distracted outside, the fireworks display having exceeded all expectations. They reached the exit without incident, the artifact safely tucked away. The plan had worked, their gamble paying off in ways none of them could have predicted. Back on the ship, Rena set the artifact down in the control room, its presence both comforting and intimidating. "So," Tivo said, crossing his arms. "What now?" "Now we figure out how to use this thing to stop a war," Rena replied, her voice filled with a conviction she'd almost forgotten she was capable of. "And if we can't?" Zara asked, the question unspoken but lingering between them. "Then we find another way," Rena said, a small smile playing on her lips. "One step at a time. We've come this far, and I'll be damned if we let it slip through our fingers now." The crew nodded, each of them feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a difference, about proving that humanity had something to offer, a force and a will as relentless as the void they called home. As Rena looked around at her crew, she felt a swell of pride and determination. Together, they'd face the darkness and emerge stronger for it. "So," she said, her gaze sweeping over them. "Who's up for saving the galaxy?" Tivo raised a hand, his expression sly. "I've got nothing better to do," Vex laughed, a rare sound that filled the room with warmth. "Count me in." Zorak, ever the pragmatist, simply nodded. It would be a shame to waste a perfectly good opportunity. Even Thrax, with all his cynicism, managed a grin. "Let's go make history, or at least not die trying." Rena felt a thrill of anticipation, the enormity of their task tempered by the knowledge that they weren't alone. Together they were unstoppable, a ragtag band of misfits with a mission. "All right, everyone," Rena said, her voice filled with determination. "Let's get to work." Because in the end, it wasn't just about saving a galaxy. It was about showing that even in the face of insurmountable odds, humanity could rise to the challenge. And that was a victory worth fighting for. As the ship prepared for its next journey, Rena felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a light to guide them home. The ship lurched back into real space like a drunk trying to find the door, awkward, unsteady, and with a certain grace that only came from doing it wrong 100 times before. The hyperspace rift zone sprawled out behind them, a miracle they'd survived it with all limbs attached and only mildly fried nerves. Touchdown without implosion, Tivo Skarn announced, his voice dripping with mock ceremony. Guess we're not dead. Yet, Rena Blix, ever the optimist, or some might say just a realist with a sense of humor, surveyed the bridge. It was a miracle, really, that their ragtag crew hadn't disintegrated into cosmic dust. She gave Captain Vex Jorlin a thumbs up, which in their line of work was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Nice flying, Tivo. I barely felt us almost dying, Rena quipped, leaning back in her seat, trying to ignore the persistent throb at her temples. Leadership, it seemed, came with a side of migraines. Vex, the captain who somehow managed to look both perpetually amused and annoyed, nodded back. I aim to please, or at least not to explode. Zara, their resident cheerleader, clapped her hands together with a forced enthusiasm that suggested she might be one nervous breakdown away from a career change. We did it, team. We actually did it, Thrax snorted. Yeah, well, let's hold off on the celebratory drinks until we know this thing isn't going to blow us all to hell. The artifact sat in the middle of the control room, ominous in its silence. It was like having a sleeping bear in the corner, and everyone was just hoping it wouldn't wake up hungry. So now what? Zorak, ever the stoic, asked. We just wait for the universe to start singing Kumbaya, Rena chuckled, though it was more out of relief than humor. Something like that. But in the meantime, we've got some serious work to do. The plan had been insane. Sneak into a vault that wasn't supposed to exist, steal an artifact that was more legend than reality, and then use it to broker peace between factions who'd rather shoot each other than talk. It was the kind of plan that sounded great in theory but had a tendency to end with someone getting vaporized. But against all odds, they'd pulled it off. Now came the hard part, convincing the galaxy to play nice. Rena found herself on the observation deck, the vast expanse of space stretching out before her like a promise, or a threat. It was always hard to tell with space. The diplomats from various factions were gathered, each looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else. It was like a dysfunctional family reunion, except with more lasers and fewer awkward hugs. Rena picked her way through the throng, datapad in hand. She didn't have time for niceties. They had a galaxy to save, after all. Ladies, gentlemen, assorted creatures, she began, plastering a smile on her face that was about as genuine as a politician's promise. Let's get down to it, shall we? Vexus, that unsettling presence who seemed more shadow than person, stepped forward. You claim this artifact can bridge the gap between our people, Captain. Rena nodded, her posture deceptively casual. That's what they tell me. And if it doesn't, well, at least we'll have a very expensive paperweight. A ripple of laughter, more nervous than amused, spread through the room. Diplomats and Xenoarchaeologists exchanged glances, each measuring the other, trying to gauge whether this was the moment their careers would soar or crash and burn. We've been at war for generations, one of the diplomats, a particularly grizzled old bird from the Tarkin faction, growled. You really think a piece of old tech can change that? Rena shrugged. Maybe, maybe not, but it's a start. And considering the alternative is just more of the same, I'd say it's worth a shot. Thrax, who'd followed her like a skeptical shadow, chimed in. Call us naive, but we've got this crazy idea that talking might actually achieve more than shooting. The room fell into a tense silence, each participant weighing their options. It was a moment heavy with potential, a crossroads where history might take a turn for the better or tumble headlong into chaos. Much to Rena's surprise, the talks didn't devolve into a brawl. There were no laser fights, no sudden explosions, just a roomful of wary diplomats dipping their toes into the waters of cooperation. No one held hands or sang songs, but in the fractured universe they lived in, even a grudging truce felt like a staggering victory. Rena watched it unfold like an outsider, her role shifting from active participant to cautious observer. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for change. Vex sidled up to her, a sly grin on his face. You think this will last, or are we all just playing dress-up before the next big blow-up? Could go either way, Rena admitted. But for now, there's a chance, and that's more than we had yesterday. So what's next? Zara asked the ever-optimist. Do we hand in our guns and take up interstellar knitting? Rena snorted. Not quite, but with the hyperspace rift zone declared a protected site, we might finally get some answers, or at least more questions that lead to bigger explosions. Tivo, who'd been eavesdropping with all the subtlety of a charging rhino, chimed in. And hey, if nothing else, we can always sell tickets. Come see the artifact that nearly killed us all. The crew laughed, the sound a welcome relief after the tension of the past days. It wasn't the end of their troubles, but it was a start, a moment of hope in a universe that often seemed determined to squash it. Back aboard their ship, the crew settled into the familiar rhythms of space travel. There were repairs to make, supplies to stock, and plans to sketch out in the messiest of detail. Peace, or whatever passed for it on the cosmic scale, required maintenance, and Rena's band of misfits were nothing if not resourceful. Zorak caught up with Rena as she was making the rounds, checking systems and double-checking the artifact's containment unit. You think we did it, made a difference? Rena considered, her hand pausing over the control panel. I think we did something. And sometimes that's all you can hope for. And if it all goes sideways, Thrax asked, joining the conversation with his usual skepticism. Then we do what we always do, Rena replied, her tone laced with dry humor. We improvise, adapt, and maybe panic a little, but we don't give up. Vex, tinkering with a particularly stubborn piece of machinery, nodded along. Sounds like a plan. A distinctly messy human plan. Tivo leaned back in his chair, arms folded behind his head. And who knows? Maybe we'll all survive long enough to retire and tell our grandkids about it. Rena couldn't help but smile at the thought. It was absurd, of course. Retirement plans were about as realistic as winning the lottery. But the idea of a future, of something beyond the constant struggle, was a comforting fiction. As the ship moved away from the rift zone, the crew worked together with a sense of camaraderie that had been forged in the fires of adversity. They might not be heroes, but they were something better. Survivors. Rena watched her crew with pride, knowing that whatever the galaxy threw at them next, they'd face it head-on with all the irreverence and defiance they could muster. So what's next on the agenda, Captain? Zara asked, her voice bright with possibility. Rena grinned, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Oh, you know the usual. Save the galaxy, get obscenely rich, retire somewhere with a nice view. And in the meantime, Zorak pressed, ever practical. In the meantime, Rena said, settling into her chair with a contented sigh, we fly. Because that's what we do best. The ship shuddered slightly as it accelerated into the black, leaving behind the hyperspace rift and its mysteries. The universe was vast, unpredictable, and often downright hostile, but for now, it held the promise of new adventures and uncharted territories. Rena closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the hum of the engines and the quiet camaraderie of her crew. It was a fleeting peace, but she'd learned to cherish the small victories, to find hope in the chaos. And as the stars unfolded before them, bright and unattainable, she felt something stir within, a spark of defiance, a refusal to bow to the darkness. For in the end, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about living, about making their mark on a universe that often seemed indifferent. Here's to the next adventure, Rena said, raising an imaginary toast to her crew. And as the ship raced forward into the unknown, she knew that whatever lay ahead, they'd meet it with the same tenacity and irreverence that had brought them this far. Because in a universe full of uncertainty, that was the only thing they could count on. Themselves, their resilience, and the bonds forged in the crucible of shared struggle. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of luck. To the stars, Thrax added, a rare smile tugging at his lips. To the stars, the crew echoed, their voices a chorus of determination. And with that they plunged into the unknown, ready to face whatever the cosmos had in store.